This is my Dodge M37 military truck that we picked up from a collector. A couple videos ago, we had to drive 6 hours to Ohio to get it. It had been sitting for many years due to a noise that was developed during a parade. Now, last video, I got this thing running. It didn't take too much work. However, it's pretty evident that that noise that originally parked this truck from the parade indicated that some pretty serious internal engine damage had occurred. So I pulled the oil pan off, started wiggling the rods, and pretty quickly came across a rod that was super loose. Here is the culprit for our knocking noise. It ended up being a rod knock. What you're looking at here is two rod bearings, not one. One is slid on top of the other rod bearing, if you can see that there. This is terrible. This is really bad. You know, I was thinking before, maybe we can just pull the rod bearings out and throw a new set of bearings in and it would be good. So needless to say, because the rod bearings look this bad, the crank also looks just as bad. If I was to throw a new set of rod bearings into this engine, it probably wouldn't last, I don't know, 15 minutes. So today, we're gonna be pulling this engine out of this Dodge M37. Before we do that, we need to take the fording kit off, which that's a snorkel, and then that is an extension for the exhaust so that it doesn't get flooded underwater. And we also need to take this rear canopy frame off because this is not gonna fit in my garage. Exhaust support is undone. These bolts are rounded off and they're pretty well seized on there. I'm just gonna cut right through the gasket and both of the bolts, and then I'll replace the bolts with some new ones. Ow, golly. Easiest way to deal with those kinds of bolts. I mean, look at those threads. Non-existent. All right, we've deleted all of the height, so hopefully it'll clear the garage door. We're gonna turn this thing around and shove the front end into the garage. Get in. You're gonna steer. let's get going. This tow bar is not from the military, so once I remove it, it's not coming back on. I have no need to have this tow bar on here. Goodbye, tow bar. Oh, it's on my arm. Oh, the dang horn is mounted to the hood. That radiator is kind of rough looking. We've got some oxidation on both corners. I'm not sure what that's from. We also have something that's going through the radiator right there. This radiator is leaking pretty badly at the top around the seams, and I think it's leaking at the bottom. So I'm gonna take it to a really good radiator shop here in Paducah, and I'll see what he thinks about it, if it needs replaced or if he can fix it up. We do have a couple more bolts on each side we gotta unscrew before we get this radiator out. That drain outlet's cooling out of the radiator now. That might take a while. This thing is actually pretty dang heavy. Now we have a lot more access to the engine. Something in the way. That's not gonna be fun to put back at all. We've got to disconnect this whole linkage assembly that's on the side of the transmission so that we can pull the transmission out with the engine. Dang it. I have to disconnect this too. Actually, that's a, power wire going to the starter. We got to disconnect the main drive line that comes from the transmission to the transfer case. Somebody just stuck a bolt in here. Golly. Somebody tightened the crap out of these. This is so stupid. Finally. It's ridiculous. disconnected now. Mounted to the transmission, we've got a PTO, and that PTO has a drive line that runs all the way up to the 10,000 pound winch, I believe it is. We got to slip this drive line back, so there's a little set screw here. Just got to undo this locking screw here. Little pry bar persuasion. That should. There we go. I can probably just hang there, I think. We've got most of our cables disconnected. We finally got the generator off. That thing is super heavy. Hopefully that stays there. Had to disconnect all kinds of different linkages leading to the transmission. There was one underneath this floorboard that was really hard to get to. We still gotta get our mounting bolts, and then we have the exhaust pipe. A couple of vent lines right there that I need to disconnect. Those are for when you wanna take this thing underwater. A couple lines to disconnect. Oh, there we go. Okay. Slowly lifting out. I think we need to start coming out with it now. Yep, the PTO is hanging onto the winch shaft. Heck yes. Finally. The winch drive shaft is finally out after lots of fighting. What a pain that was. Dumping coolant now. Golly. Oh, we moved quite a bit there. Dang, hour-long video of just me pulling the engine. I really hope this thing will clear the transmission. Oh yeah. Heck yeah. Actually clears the winch pretty good. That's surprising. officially out. Putting it back in is the hard part, but we did get it out. The engine and transmission are out. I'm gonna take this jack here, move it up under the transmission, and there's about 4 bolts, I believe. And we're gonna unbolt this transmission from the bell housing. That'll just make it easier to move the bell housing off the engine. I haven't read any manuals, but from what I can tell, it looks like you're supposed to unbolt the bell housing and then pick it up off the flywheel. Here's your throwout bearing. Yeah, this spring's supposed to be hooked up to something, and because it's not, what that means is the bearing is not going to release from the clutch. And this is just gonna spin and spin and spin. Rather than pulling it back off of the clutch, this bearing will just wear out a whole lot quicker, and it seems like it might be wore out. We'll definitely have to replace this. Also, there's not supposed to be this much grease in here. This definitely came from this bearing. While I appreciate frame-off restorations, you run the risk of other people's faults, you know. You're no longer gambling with factory imperfections. Now you're gambling with whoever the heck, you know, took this thing apart and put it back together. Because somebody didn't connect that, or they connected it in a way that it came off. It's not supposed to come off. It's no big deal. It's a good example of stuff you run into. Now we just have to take off this bell housing. The throttle linkage for this thing is pretty insane. Look at all of the moving parts on this. And then the pedal would connect to this. There's another set of linkage inside of the truck though that would move that. There we go. Remember this next time you say they don't build them like they used to, because trust me, back then engineers also hated everybody, including themselves, back in the old days too. I don't know what this is supposed to be, but it's just an elbow that's capped off. Oh, and you can't rotate it because the oil dipstick tube is in the way. You're kidding me. Come on, please. Just come out. This is ridiculous. Okay, so if you ever plan on replacing your starter on one of these, make sure you remove the dipstick tube because, yeah, that's how they put it together. Different size bolt. That's cool. A lot of coolant in there. Two different size bolts again. Gotta pull and twist, pull and twist. There's a whole lot of clutch dust about to fall out of here. Whoopsies. That thing's heavy. Heavy girl. This clutch plate looks a little bit worn out, but I can't tell. I'm gonna have to measure it. I'm gonna replace it anyways when we put this engine back in, but I'm interested to see if it's wore out or not. To remove this flywheel, we have nuts on the inside of the flywheel that we have to undo.
I couldn't get this engine stand to fit 4 bolts, so I only used 2 bolts. I kind of figured this was gonna happen. I also couldn't get these 4 to line up on the engine stand either, because my next plan was to use a bell housing to bolt up to it. So I've only got 2 grade 8.8 bolts holding this thing in. All in the name of trying to get this crankshaft out of this engine before I go on vacation in like 12 hours. Dang. Gosh. There we go. Dang it. These things are on there. When I was under the truck, I removed 1 and 2. 1 is clearly our culprit. That is where I found my pancake bearing. Anyways, number 2 is also not looking too hot. Right there on the edge, we've got some chipping. I'm not totally sure what could cause that. Maybe some back and forth movement from the crank. I can't get it to move at all. Maybe just a really badly ground crankshaft. These are 10 thousandths over rod bearings, which means the crankshaft has been ground down 10 thousandths of an inch. This is number 3. Coming out pretty nicely, unlike the other ones. Yeah, that looks fine to me. Number 4. Oh. This rod bearing also seems to be all right. Number 5, and a little note to self, Braden. The numbers are facing the passenger side of the engine. Again, that looks, pretty normal. And number 6, which is usually the rod bearing that always goes out first. Looks pretty normal. Nothing wrong there. Got some flatheads that have probably been torqued to 100 foot-pounds, I'm sure. Yep. I knew these would come in handy at some point. Yes, sir. I do remember we were leaking out of the front of the oil pan. This may have been the culprit here. This camshaft gear is supposed to have 3 bolts instead of 2. What has happened is the threads have been destroyed in this bottom one. By destroyed, I mean they're like broken off. I can see through it. So whoever the super professional rebuilder was just left 2 in there, which it's worked for this amount of time, but this is a pretty important component. We'll probably end up replacing this. Let's see. Oh yeah. Something about this is just so satisfying to me. We haven't pulled these crank caps yet, but I'm willing to bet that these are probably also gonna be oversized. Other than the ginormous scar we have right there that I can feel with my thumb, this looks pretty good. I don't know why there's a big cut right there though. I don't need to mix these 2 up. They're exact same numbers. But I wanna make sure they go back where they belong. That one also looks perfectly fine. These are coming out really easy. This one looks good as well. That almost looks like it says 0.30. So maybe this has been ground down 30. There we go. It's a big old bearing. I don't see any numbers on that at all. Oh, there we go. 0.30. 0.30 on the journals. So of all of these journals, we only found one in question, and that is number 1 cylinder. That bearing was completely destroyed. That has to be where our knock was coming from. The plan with this engine is to send this crank off to the machine shop. They're gonna have to ground it down, which means taking a little bit of this metal off perfectly around each of these journals. Then we will have to put some new oversized bearings on this crank, and hopefully this thing will be back on the road in no time, depending on how long it takes for the machine shop to get done and what other projects I have coming up, which if you look at that board, you can't see that board, but there's a lot of stuff coming up. It's unfortunate, but it's also fortunate because I would have never ended up with this truck if it wasn't for that rod knock. Golly, this thing's so heavy. Oh, goodness.